Indigenous leaders are readying themselves for a potential change in federal leadership. In their 9 years in office, the Trudeau government has been both praised for its efforts toward key issues like truth and reconciliation and launching a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But we know there is still work to be done when it comes to court cases and access to clean drinking water. And uncertainty lies ahead with a potential federal election on the horizon. So to discuss what a change in Ottawa could mean for Indigenous peoples, let's bring in Pam Palmater, Mi'kmaq lawyer and chair in Indigenous governance at Toronto Metropolitan University. Good morning, Pam.
Good morning.
I always like to lay the groundwork by saying we don't know the outcome, and the official, date for a federal election is in October. But we do know that Justin Trudeau is stepping down. So before we get into a potential change, let's talk about some of the accomplishments that the Trudeau government brought forward for First Nations.
Well, and I think that's important. We have to be fair about what has and hasn't happened. There were significant accomplishments in terms of having a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, incorporating the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one of the only countries in the world to do that, having legislation that protects Indigenous languages, having legislation that protects the safety of First Nation kids in care, not litigating. So across the board, engaging in settlements. So settlements for compensation for First Nation kids in care, compensation for Inuit, compensation for First Nations, lack of First Nations water on reserves. So there's pretty significant things, and removing big chunks of sex discrimination in the Indian Act has actually meant a great deal to Indigenous women and girls across the country.
All right, let's talk about the promises. There were a lot of them starting in 2015, and some of them he's going to leave office without having met them. Which ones are key to you?
Well, the biggest one to me is he campaigned on this promise of respecting free, prior, and informed consent for any development on our lands. And when asked by the media, so does that mean, does no mean no? Will you respect that? And he said, absolutely. And one of the first things he did when he got into office was buy a pipeline and support the RCMP going in and arresting our people and stopping our people from living on our territories. So when it comes to resource development, the Trudeau government has not differed from previous governments in that sense. That's pretty significant. He hasn't met all the calls to action from the TRC. He's met a number of them, but not all of them. He hasn't really started on all of the calls for justice on the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, though he did very significantly accept the findings of historic and ongoing genocide. There's lots of other things. I think the biggest one right now is the settlement for long-term reform in child and family services for First Nations on reserve. That one, it's literally on the cusp. So if they're able to hang on and they can finish that, that'll be very, very significant, but that would be a significant one that doesn't get done. And of course, there's a whole bunch of legislative things that are to come as well.
All right, so there's a lot of work that needs to be completed, not just promises unmet, but really work that needs to be done by whatever government comes into power. Let's talk about the Conservatives. They are leading by more than 20 points in the polls. Can you give us a sense of the relationship between Indigenous leaders and Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives? Mr. Poilievre has been on this program twice. When we talked one time about sort of his lens or his view on Indigenous issues, we've heard him talk about economic support. But where does this relationship sit right now as of today?
Well, two things. First is his idea, this broad idea of economic reconciliation. That does not translate to funding for social programs and for First Nations governance and First Nations advocacy organizations. We know from the previous government they engaged in massive cuts, and he's hinted at massive cuts at the federal level as well. His idea of economic reconciliation really is about natural resource extraction. like mining and lumber and all of those things with so-called willing partners, the same kind of terminology that Harper used. And in terms of the relationship, there is not a great relationship, and in most cases, no relationship at all. Another significant difference with the Trudeau government, lots of access to ministers and cabinet and senior officials for negotiations and doing work. On this side, Pierre Poilievre doesn't really meet with people. He has not really good at coming on media and having extended conversations, not on Indigenous media, that's for certain. And at the last AFN Assembly, which is the first he's attended, chiefs turned their back on him and said, you know, you're saying horrible things about Indigenous peoples and residential schools and things like that. So they wanted to have nothing to do with him. It's not a good sign.
Pam Palmander, Micmac lawyer and chair of Indigenous governance at Toronto Metropolitan University. A good conversation and the right time to have it. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks.
If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.